Hey, nice meeting you.
Ja, goed. Ja.
And I have to admit them again
Goed zo.
to the name, right?
Kijken nog een beetje.
Let me know when you're ready for the PowerPoint.
You can already.
Oh wait.
You don't know where to put it. No, sorry.
Okay. No, I thought it was in that computer.
Yeah.
Just all right.
You're the only one staying, Melike.
I'm doing.
Oh, that's terrible.
No one is caring about that.
What's that?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Hi, Diego. Maybe come
That's
a
also
bit
new.
closer. I don't know how big the group will be.
No? Wow.
Huh?
Now this device is like really fancy now, the screen and wow.
And also, if it doesn't switch once you plug it in, the way you switch to, like, from it being on the screen to the computer is here. You swipe and then you connect, like, then one of those will be blue as well, and this one, and then you click on that one.
But I click on that there in the screen.
Yeah, so supposedly,
yeah,
for
let's
example,
do
just plug it in, for example.
Because if people come
For me to move it, I
later in,
just.
yeah.
Yeah, so now it connects to the laptop automatically.
Ah, perfect.
Okay, and now you take it out.
Yeah, I think it's nice.
Then we don't have to do the switch. Yeah, perfect. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is all set, right? Okay,
Does
great.
the mouse also work?
No,
Okay. Okay. Fine.
that one, and there was another, yeah, you call the pen, you don't really need the pen. Actually, just
turn
do it
around
on
and
the screen.
Okay.
Yes.
Maybe.
The clock works again, yes. Ik heb mijn batterij van huis meegenomen bij je.
Maar we hebben batterijen.
Just to know where I am.
Ik kon niks vinden, niet op
Gewoon in het laadje van de batterijen.
Oh.
Waar je bent er.
Nou, ik kwam een bakje met batterijen tegen en nou verklaart het ook waarom die helemaal leeg nu zijn chemisch afval geworden.
Yeah.
Well, you can already start and I start to.
Yeah, so it's recording and then yeah. Let me just see.
Amazing that camera.
Yeah.
I'm amazed.
Here. This is it.
Let me just check. So you're with the Institute of Asian Studies?
Area studies.
Oh, with area studies?
Yeah.
No, but you're also connected to the.
And then every time someone is here,
So
I
that
just
is why it's
Yeah,
I think
basically. And then
the abbreviation is very similar.
Yes, it's a little bit.
Oh, okay.
But area studies actually means Asian studies.
when the
So that's
discussion
also-
comes,
yeah, it's weird.
I let him
So
talk. basically.
African studies,
I
Latin
mute him.
American studies
Yeah.
are not in area studies. They are area
Ah.
studies is only Asian.
Yeah.
Don't ask
But
me
the
why.
institute is called Institute of Asian Studies.
and then when
Institute
yeah.
for area
When he
studies.
comes, I
For
just connect it
area,
and then
sorry.
Exactly.
it should be
This is
there.
how
the
hazy I am
people
today.
who are here can
And then,
unmute themselves. So it's basically the most important thing. Is
And
keep
you're
unmuted
with the
and then-
International Studies program, right?
International relations.
Yeah, exactly. So it wasn't as complicated as we.
I hope I will say correctly. It's better.
It sounds more
It took me a few years. So.
It's like the plugging in.
For area studies.
Oh, there it is. Okay, so you have to remember it.
Yeah. And then
Can you hear her?
No, okay. And tell me, remind me again, what is the UK university?
This is the guy.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So,
Shall I ask or they
so
should?
you said it was
They are here.
copy pasted a few parts from the thing.
Sorry, that was for what we were working on.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah, but no, I was just
meeting,
curious. So,
right?
did you go to the Netherlands with the fee? Oh, okay. But now you applied.
I actually applied for the ERC first,
Yeah.
got to the final round, I didn't
Yeah,
get
well,
it.
but at some point it's going to
Exactly,
be
that's the
Feedback,
point.
I
So,
wrote the
because it's
proposal,
recording,
sent it
it's
for
also
the
important that the
meeting,
screen
Yeah.
stays.
and it got rejected. They said, we are not going to send it to reviewers,
And
it's
then
not up
after
to the
that,
standards. And it had reached the last stage of the ERC. I don't know. It's like this error in this qualification.
But they never told what was.
Well, the
before,
quality of the remaining application is higher, and I just think it's not worth it. It's things that happen.
After that we have the
Wow, I'm surprised.
For me, I mean, I was not expecting I should get it or anything, but I thought like, if I got to the last round of the RC, then I got to revise it, and at least it should
But how can
get to the review.
But they are listening to it's already I don't think you will have a big crowd.
That's right. I'm not used to crowds any longer, so it's good to train little by little.
Okay, let's just wait 1 or 2
You know,
minutes.
do you know how many people did they need to register?
Yeah, they need to register, so I think there was, Akai is there.
Yes.
Yeah, perfect.
Yes.
Cool. Kai and one other person.
Oh, well, no, okay.
Is it already past?
Yes.
Is that clock correct?
Now exactly.
Now.
I think a few more
Okay.
people are gonna come.
Yeah, let's wait 2 3 minutes. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, if there's anything.
Hoe beneden staat.
Oh,
Maar er is toch, was toch een mevrouw, of niet? Nou, niet hoe het stond, 15 jaar. Later was zo, Willem veranderde een pakje aan.
ja.
Of die gebleven is.
Jawel, nee, normaal is het 15, dus dan had je
Ja.
misschien dat ze nog recent was.
Oh, dat zou kunnen.
Nee, dat klopt. Dat die bel die is niet doorgeschakeld volgens mij.
Oké.
Nee, nou ja, wij zijn natuurlijk ook helemaal niet meer zo gewend aan mensen. Die wel ja, het is ook niet zo dat een soort toestand in man.
Nee, dat is niet. Nee, stop.
Nee, maar het was dus ook, de deur ging dus niet open.
Nee.
Oké, maar nu inmiddels wel, begrijp ik?
Nou, wij zijn binnengekomen door een meneer met een vrouw die de open. En toen zagen we inderdaad een
Ja. Oké, ik vraag nog wel even aan Gaia. Het is wel vervelend als de mensen
No commitment. Yeah.
Yeah.
Was there someone when you came in? Where are you from?
I'm from Spain.
Spain.
Okay.
You're from Turkey?
Turkey, but I think you're going to the.
You've been in the Netherlands for a while, or?
Yeah, we start to master here.
Okay, so
And student from Spain. And I'm thinking about my thesis about Argentina Chinese.
Do you know Argentina well? Is it?
Yes.
You have a connection?
I have lots of connections there because I used to work for the economic forum in Turkey. For 7 years, I used to travel to the region a lot, so I have very good connections there. I know people, and you know, China and Uruguay are about to sign a free trade agreement.
Yeah.
And Uruguay is the member of the Mercosur trade bloc, so it would be interesting for next year, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, there's lots of stuff written on China, Argentina, with broader analysis of the region, but I haven't seen anything, or very little, that is dedicated just to China-Argentina relations. So it would be interesting to have a thesis on that. That's good.
This is the moment that I welcome you all. Hi, everyone. Very nice to have you here. Not a big crowd, but at least we have a real crowd, a face-to-face lecture again in our series. And I am very happy that Ruben Gonzalez-Vicente is here with us. He is an expert on China's activities, Chinese activities, China-Latin America relations already for many years. So when I started working on that subject, his work on Chinese mining investments really attracted my attention. And I'm also pleased that now we're actually collaborating together in a small project, together also with Diego here and Michiel Bout for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where we're looking at what is actually happening at the moment with the new trends of Chinese governmental, or political, I should say, and economic relations with the region. And you started working a lot on Latin America, but you have expanded the area of your interest to the Caribbean. So we thought it would be nice to now have you tell a bit on that recent work that you've been doing on Chinese influences in the Caribbean region, which is of course a big region with a lot of diversity. So let me not steal more time from you. Just very briefly, you can see he works at the University of Leiden in the Institute for Area Studies, I thought it was Asian Studies, and also in the International Relations program, but not for so long anymore, because in a few months you'll be moving to the University of Birmingham. So we're pleased to have you here already for the moment. Well, if you'd like to chat more, there is today the Q&A, of course. We will have drinks again after the lecture. We thought we couldn't have them, but we will do it upstairs at the 5th floor for a bit more space. So that is a little bit more time for informal engagement. And then our discussant, who was planning to come by train from Maastricht, Kai Thompson, couldn't take that train today, and he is there online. So we're going to see if it works to have a few of his questions and remarks. So have a really hybrid meeting. I hope technology supports that. He's been reading some of the pieces that you've been writing, so it would be nice to have him. But if not, we have a good group here of people, experts on the subject or interested in the subject. So I think we'll have a good discussion. Ruben, thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
Well, thanks everyone for coming. Thanks, Barbara, for inviting me. I came here already, I think, 4 or 5 years ago when I just arrived to the Netherlands, and we had a great session. So I'm really pleased to be back at CEDLA. I'm a bit rusty. I haven't been speaking in front of an audience for 2 years now. So bear with me, but I'll try to make this as pleasant as possible. So yeah, I had been studying China and Latin America for a few years, since 2007. And it was only 2016-17 that I started focusing a little bit on the Caribbean and realizing that some of the developmental dynamics of the relationship are a little bit different from what is going on with the rest of Latin America. And I'm going to try to tell you about it today. I want to start with 3 anecdotes, 3 small vignettes that will illustrate some of the arguments that I want to do through the presentation. The first one, I need to go back 2 years ago when a few of my friends from Jamaica started sharing with me news that were appearing in the local newspapers about what was called, in those newspapers, a new Cold War that was emerging between China and the United States. This was all because a Chinese company, which is called Genlot Game Technology, was going to be in charge of the Jamaican National Lottery. So at that time, the US Embassy started writing lots of articles in local newspapers. The US ambassador came out to criticize China and to say that this was a real threat for Jamaica's national security. At the same time, the Chinese ambassador realized he also needed to come out in the media and start defending his country, and actually also attacking the United States, saying that they were very hypocritical in their commitment to free trade, because when a Chinese company was able to get hold of a business, then they will just start criticizing it. So yeah, there was this whole debate about a new Cold War, and I just thought it was really overblown and exaggerated. When you think about it, in the Cold War, at least there was a pretense of an ideological vision from the Soviet Union and the United States. And here you had 2 companies trying to manage a gambling business, hardly 2 different world visions. But anything that has to do with China tends to be overblown in the media. Another similar anecdote is about how much of the regional media, and media also beyond the region, talks about debt traps This is a common accusation for Chinese banks, for Chinese corporations, that they are creating new debt traps in the region, and that regional economies are going to be tied in a dependent way to the Chinese economy for years. It's very surprising to be hearing this from the Caribbean. This is a region with some of the highest debt to GDP ratios in the world for 40 years now. And these are debts that are held with the IMF and Western banks rather than with China. Jamaica, again, to use the same example, has a debt to GDP ratio of 120%, and only 12% of that is to Chinese banks. It's still significant. It's not that it is insignificant, but to talk about a debt trap in that context is, again, a little bit overblown. And the last one, it's an anecdote of lucky chance that I got to participate in a PhD qualifying presentation in the University of West Indies in Trinidad, where a local researcher was engaging on a debate about international relations, norms, diffusion, and with terms and theories that were very topical within the discipline of international relations. But what was really surprising for me is that the story I was hearing reminded me so much of what I had heard, what I had read from regional authors who were writing in the 60s and the 70s and talking about this idea of epistemic dependency, which was not at all mentioned in this presentation. And what I realized is that lots of what you can, what's going on with China and the region, and with the region in general, can still be explained with some of the theories that were created in the region. And I'm going to try to engage those. So three broad arguments just now as I start. The first is that despite all the hype, China's economic engagements with the region remain elite-led and business-centric, and they haven't had a truly transformative impact. China has helped to shift the hierarchies of development in the region with new actors now, but it hasn't really transformed the region's broad developmental trajectory. Second one, and this is obvious, you cannot understand China's engagements with the region if you don't understand the context, if you don't understand the history of the region, going back all the way back to the colonial period, and also very clearly to recent decades of structural adjustment, debt, and struggling governmental budgets. And finally, as I was saying just now, the region's tradition of critical development thought remains surprisingly relevant and useful to explain and theorize the relations between China and the Caribbean. So I need to touch on many screens, but because I have the presentation here so I can see it too. Okay, so this is what I'm going to do, actually. I'm going to try to give you that context of China-Caribbean relations, and I'm going to cover 4 theories and perspectives that come from local literature on development, from traditional critical Caribbean thought. And I'm going to explain to you how these perspectives are still very relevant to understand China's relations with the Caribbean. So mention that a lot of what I'm going to be talking about here is in this article that I wrote with Annita Montoute. Oh, I didn't write her name there.
She's not there.
Sorry, but yeah, but she's responsible for anything that is interesting that I say today. You can blame me for whatever is wrong. But yeah, Annita Montoute is also part of many of these ideas from the University of the West Indies. Okay, so starting with a little bit of the context, I'm going to try to summarize a little bit what's going on between China and the Caribbean today. Bilateral trade stands at too many screens. Bilateral trade stands at 3.5 billion US dollars today. Chinese investments in the region go up to $9 billion US dollars, and Chinese banks have provided loans to regional governments for a value of almost also $9 billion US dollars. So the 2 key vectors for the engagement are investment and finance. We can also try to distinguish about 3 different types of Chinese investments in the region. In the first group, I like to put companies that have a cumulative impact in the region's economy. These are companies that invest in consolidated sectors in the region, such as tourism in the Bahamas or Barbados, and also in rising sectors within the region, such as the oil sector in Guyana. The impact that these companies have is cumulative in the sense that they join other transnational investors in the region, they invest in the same sectors, and they help to develop these sectors further, but they add to existing trends in terms of economic development. In a second group, I'd like to put a number of Chinese businesses that have gone to invest into sunset industries that were starting to struggle in the context of the Caribbean. These companies, in some cases, have been able to revitalize businesses by cutting costs, basically cutting salaries for workers, but also Chinese managers that join these projects. And they have invested, for example, in Jamaica's sugar sector without much success, as I will explain later, or in a major alumina plant in Jamaica as well. So decaying sectors, sunset industries. The third type of investment is perhaps the one that you hear the most about because it's the most special. And it usually involves a tandem of Chinese state finance, banks that provide loans, and Chinese construction companies that go and build up new projects. So now you have Chinese contractors involved in expanding ports and airports in places like Antigua and Barbuda or Guyana, building roads in places like Bahamas or Jamaica, constructing and rehabilitating hotels in places like Bahamas, Barbados, Guyana, developing government buildings and hospitals in places like Antigua and Barbuda again, Trinidad and Tobago, building new convention centers, Antigua and Barbuda, Guyana, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and even planning industrial parks, or at least planning the construction of the infrastructure for industrial parks in places like Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago. Most of these companies and these investments operate within government-to-government frameworks. They involve a loan from a Chinese bank, usually at a market rate, that purchases the services of a Chinese state-owned construction company. Local governments in turn provide sovereign guarantees for repayment, which reduces the risk of the investment. And in some cases, the loans are paid back with commodities or public assets rather than just hard currency. And this third type of investment is quite interesting because it has reactivated government spending through this finance in a region that has been crippled by high levels of debt for decades now. Of course, it has also open debates about debt sustainability and about the prices that are being paid for projects that are not subject to open tenders or public deliberation. So, I'm trying to give you a little bit more context about these different types of investments. I also want to divide between two major types that have less to do with the impact and more with the model of investment that China is using. The first case, I'm actually using an example from Peru. I think you wouldn't mind here. And the thing is, there are not so many cases like this in the Caribbean. There are a few, but not so many. And I studied it more in Peru, so I can tell you about it. So here you have two cases of companies that have invested through traditional channels. So all Chinese mining companies that arrived to Peru in a wave of investments after 2007 acquired their projects through international stock markets in Toronto and London. They relied on studies by international consultants, engaged the same Peruvian law firms that allow them to negotiate land rights, for example, and hired local staff and subcontracted local and international companies to run many of their operations. All of these companies in Peru situate their projects in Peru within carefully developed strategies for corporate development. So for example, CEDLA connected its mine in Peru, or its project for a mine in Peru, I should say, to a new 200,000 ton refinery plant in China. They wanted the copper to feed this plant. So it was part of a corporate strategy to procure resources for this plant. Jiangxi Copper, on the other hand, and China Min Metals went into Peru with a different type of corporate strategy. China Min Metals had been involved in metals trading internationally for many years, and Jiangxi Copper in refining copper. And each of them wanted to learn from the other. China Min Metals wanted to learn about mining in itself, and Jiangxi Copper wanted to learn about operating internationally. And they saw this, again, as a process of developing their own understanding of international markets and their capacities. Again, this type of investment, I mentioned this before, has more of a quantitative or cumulative impact rather than transformative, because these are companies investing in a very consolidated sector in Peru. Mining is nothing new for Peru. And you have examples like this in the Caribbean too. So companies, again, investing in alumina in Jamaica, or trying to invest in the oil sector in Guyana, or timber in Suriname. This is nothing unusual. So this is a type of investment that goes through traditional channels, and it is not too different from other forms of transnational investment. Now, there's a second type of investment that is more unique to China, and here's where I place Chinese infrastructural investments in the Caribbean. And I can give you here an example, the North-South Highway in Jamaica. This is a project that had been initially started by a French contractor, which left after encountering financial and technical problems to develop the highway, to finish the highway. At that point, Jamaica's Minister of Transport and Works was asked by the country's prime minister to go to China and try to negotiate an agreement that allowed to complete this road without adding to the burden, to the budget burden, to the debt of the country. So what happened was this complex financial engineering. Basically, you had lots of factors involved. So you had first high-level government negotiations, including both governments. Then you have state policy banks from China that offered to put in the money, and a state-owned construction company from China. The negotiations resulted in a $457 million loan that went directly, not to the Jamaican government, but to the Chinese company that will build the highway, CEC. The loan itself was not going to be repaid with cash, with money. It was going to be paid with the transfer, and it was paid with the transfer of 1,200 acres of land in the north and in the south of the island, while at the same time CEC, the company that constructed the project, got to manage the tolls of the highway for 50 years. So you can see that this is complex financial engineering and a model of investment that is quite unique to China. And what is interesting is that through these partnerships, heavily indebted governments in the region are able to pay in kind, sometimes such as with land, and are also able to access loans without the type of macroeconomic conditionalities that the World Bank or the IMF will usually require. These loans, however, have conditions. The projects require what I have called spaces of exception, where sovereignty is circumvented to enable the realization of profit. So in this case in particular, the company was allowed to bring Chinese workers, which remain subject to Chinese law in terms of the salaries they were paid, in the sense that they couldn't join freely labor unions. And in a way, they were transposing China's repressive labor regime into Jamaican territory and making the projects cheaper in this way. At the same time, the company CEC remained exempted from custom duties on equipment that they could import into the island, and other taxes as well. So this company was able to focus on making a profit, but it was also allowed an business-friendly environment, which was designed just for this project, and which was available only for this company in this case. So how do we start theorizing and understanding and explaining many of these trends that I'm starting to describe here? As I mentioned at the beginning, I find it very useful to rely on critical Caribbean thought that has been created through the last 50 years or even more. So here I'm borrowing some of their terms, ideas, perspectives. The first of them, this idea about passive incorporation. Caribbean scholars argued already in the 60s, 70s that the region, that one of the problems with development in the region was that it had been passively incorporated into the world economy. This meant that the Caribbean was under a structurally subservient role during the colonial years, that it endured economic dependency in the immediate post-independence years, and that it went through extreme vulnerability in the liberalized world market after the 80s. Annita and I argue that there are three ways in which China reinforces these trends of passive incorporation. First, the engagement with China increases or exacerbates the production hierarchies between different regions. Second, there are structural limitations associated to the types of Chinese investments available in the region. And third, the ways in which low transparency impedes an effective regulation of investment flows is also contributing to passive incorporation. China cannot really be considered a metropole or a center in the way that traditional dependency theory discusses these terms. But China's key economic features, a huge low-wage labor force and a high demand for commodities, have tended to crowd out other countries from other developing economies from manufacturing sectors and relocated value chains to Asia, resulting in negative trade balances across the Caribbean as manufacturing closed down and the countries increasingly needed to focus on natural resources. The focus of Chinese investments on infrastructures and consolidated sectors adds on to these trends. Chinese investments and loans for infrastructure surpass any other type of investments in the region. 18 out of 23 loans from China's policy banks are concentrated in construction projects in the region. Without careful planning, these infrastructural projects will struggle to generate sufficient economic activity to make up for a rising debt burden. Adding to these trends is also the fact that many Chinese construction companies rely on Chinese labor, as I discussed just a minute ago, and this limits, of course, local employment opportunities that will otherwise have existed with these projects. There are also concerns that Chinese companies are undercutting national contractors thanks to the series of privileges that they enjoy. As I say, low taxes, access to cheaper labor. This is pushing local contractors out of the market. And actually, local contractors have complained about this repeatedly, and in interviews they will tell me not that they wish Chinese companies didn't have access to cheap labor and low taxes, but that they also wish that they could have access to cheap labor and low taxes. So overall, Chinese companies have the upper hand in these relations and incorporate the Caribbean into the orbit of the Chinese economy while forcing the region into a passive role, which replicates the patterns that local critical authors have described in their work in the recent decades. Okay, oops. Sorry about that. The second idea that I want to discuss is that of epistemic dependency, which is also an idea from some Caribbean authors, including people like Fanon, Garvey, Beckford, Best. From this perspective, the People's Republic of China, China has had a paradoxical impact on the region from the perspective of epistemic or knowledge dependency. On the one hand, it has restored political power, political leeway to central government leaders, And on the other hand, it has contributed to undermining emancipatory development approaches. We should note first here how Chinese finance and investments have increased political maneuvering space for regional governments away from US or European Union guidance. Regional leaders can now triangulate. They can go to different partners and choose from whatever loans they think are better for their conditions, and they can access loans without macroeconomic conditionalities, which is actually huge. Is one of the main complaints that you see in regional literature up until this century about all the macroeconomic conditionalities that came with Western loans. But there are obvious limitations to what Chinese finance can offer to the region. In particular, and as I mentioned also before, Chinese finance is limited in terms of content. They promote a narrow developmental template that is focused only on infrastructures. This is because Chinese investments, as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, do not respond to benevolent or intent or to an aid purpose, but they are part of a strategy to internationalize China's infrastructural sector now that the market for infrastructures in China is down. There's problems of overaccumulation. So the main goal of these loans is to create markets for Chinese companies in this particular sector, infrastructures. Also importantly, China's approach has narrowed the scope for social participation. Infrastructural agreements are reached in government-to-government negotiations, and they bypass open tenders. So there are little opportunities for the people of the Caribbean, normal people, to participate. This has in turn consolidated a top-down, elite-led model of governance that eschews transparency and participation in terms of decision-making and scrutiny, and contributes to this form of epistemic dependency. Let me give you an example. In 2017, if I remember correctly, the government of Grenada was approached by Chinese authorities. The government of Grenada approached Chinese authorities to find help to develop jointly a national development strategy for Grenada. This was a plan, again, drafted by Chinese partners that involved the construction of a highway, a railway, a deep water port, a wind farm, and also it involved the modernization of the Maurice Bishop International Airport. As part of the plan, there was also a call to take strong measures to protect foreign investors. So this is an example of how this didn't actually materialize because there was lots of public backlash against it, but you can observe this trend of epistemic dependency at play here, with a local government approaching Chinese authorities to ask for a national development plan, which ultimately is based on infrastructures because that's what China needs to promote internationally. It falls quite short of providing a new model or an emancipatory alternative to prevalent models of development. Okay, when faced with some of these challenges that the region experiences, local authors, critical authors have usually presented an internationalist outlook. So they have been they promoted in the 60s, 70s, the idea of a third world, of certain developmental independence for countries in the region. They also promoted Pan-African internationalism. And at the center of what they wanted to do was the idea of a regional project, of different countries in the region collaborating together to create new models of development. They thought that this will allow the region to act as a market and institutional bloc in negotiations, which will strengthen their position. And they also thought that this will allow to develop economies of scale, which will be more productive. The actual history of what happened since the 70s is that national interests have taken priority over regional ones. And So there have been problems with this regional integration project for a while, but China's engagement in the region has worked to reinforce national elites and interests to the detriment of both broader regional collaboration and civil society participation. So as I say, the CARICOM, the Caribbean community, has never truly lived up to its expectations. It uses a minimalist approach to governance. It functions as a community of sovereign states, which has a common market, but it privileges top-down approaches based on the decisions of individual countries. But there are two ways in which China has reinforced these trends. On the one hand, first, China has prioritized closed-door bilateral negotiations with nation-state governments over other forms of political and diplomatic engagement. The forums in which China participates focus on creating goodwill, but the actual negotiations, the deals, are sealed in bilateral negotiations. Also importantly, second, China does not hold diplomatic relations with a number of Caribbean countries: Belize, Haiti, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and St. Lucia, all the saints. This is because these countries have a diplomatic relationship with Taiwan. So China has avoided sitting in regional forums that involve these countries too. And the fact that China is not using these regional channels for communication is also helping to undermine the regional project. And third, as I mentioned before, no, I haven't mentioned this before, sorry. But one thing that has happened also is that China, in promoting these bilateral channels, has forced or has contributed to promoting a race to the bottom in CARICOM, as countries compete with each other to host the projects of Chinese companies. So there was, for example, a lot of talk about a deep water port that every country in the region wanted to host, which China was offering to finance. And rather than collaborating, all countries were trying to fight over for it, offering the best possible conditions for Chinese investment. And finally, and this, yes, I have mentioned, is how China blocks civil society participation in its forums with the region and in bilateral dealings. There is therefore very little supranational regulation and little to none bottom-up participation. Together with the CARICOM's own shortcomings, China's role in the region contributes to making this possibility of a regional project, a meaningful regional project, an even more distant prospect. And this is the last perspective or theoretical insight to explain the relationship that I have for you today, which is this broad idea of post-colonial legacies. And of course, many Caribbean authors discuss how the internal sociological makeup of the region has evolved from its history as a plantation economy, plantations economies, and how this still affects in many ways the sociological makeup of the region. This is not necessarily directly about the impact that China has on development trends in the region. This is more about how the region's own developmental reality affects the way in which these projects actually take place and how they develop. So I want to share two examples with you. Let me see. No, the first one I don't have a slide, but the first one is about sugar investments by Chinese companies in the sugar sector in Jamaica. There's this company called Complant International, which invested in the sector in Jamaica in 2010. They're buying 3 factories and 18,000 hectares for a period of 49 years, so a concession. The company was planning to reduce production costs of sugar by 30% so that it would be competitive in international markets, but it became impossible. Productivity was never raised, and Chinese companies blame low productivity in the island, and they also say that there were some cultural barriers for communication with the people that were not really enabling for productivity to be boosted up. But the reality is more complex and has to do with the way in which sugar the sugar sector was developed in Jamaica. The sugar sector was already unproductive by the time of independence in Jamaica. And Michael Manley and other leaders that came after him focused on the sector as one that could provide full employment and livelihoods to people in rural areas through party-centric, clientelistic networks. So the goal was never in the sugar sector in Jamaica, international productivity. It was social justice in the form of full employment in rural areas and votes. And in this context, it was from the beginning very difficult that a Chinese investor would transform the social reality just by coming with plans for productivity. So yeah, that's one example of how local trends are impacting on Chinese investments. The other one, a little bit different, can be found in Trinidad and Tobago. There are two main parties in Trinidad and Tobago, one with a majority of Afro-Trinidadian electorate, the PNM, and another with a majority of Indo-Trinidadian electorate, the UNC. This project, the Napa, which is one of, I think, is the biggest building now in Port of Spain, the capital of Trinidad, was seen as the flagship project of the relationship between the PNM, the Afro-Trinidadian Party, with China. While it was being built, there were many problems with the construction and other issues. And what is important here is that the UNC, the other party, the Indo-Trinidadian Party, was always very critical of everything that was going on with this project and about the need to construct the project. This was completed in 2009. In 2010, the UNC came to power and they continued with the construction of a very, very similar building in the south of the island, in the city of San Fernando. So they have been really critical about this project. The second project, the very similar project that they developed in San Fernando, was there because the base for their electorate is also there. Well, this is what most people speculate. Why would they construct the same building twice? And it's probably a good explanation. So in the previous example I gave you, the investments of Chinese companies were prevented, stopped, they were unproductive because of the sociological reality on the ground in Jamaica. In this case, a company, the Shanghai Construction Group, got to build the same building almost twice, thanks to the complex racial, ethnic, and electoral relations that exist in Trinidad and Tobago. At the same time that this all was happening, local artists complain. They say that they were never consulted. These are convention centers for arts, for performances. And local artists, they say they were never, nobody talked with them. And they claimed in the local media that development is not about buildings, it is about people, the energy of the people, which could seem like a fundamental critique of the Chinese model of development in the Caribbean to a certain extent. Okay, so I'm just gonna conclude the way I started by saying that China's engagement in the region has not really transformed the broader developmental model, the basis, the economic basis of any of these societies, but it has indeed reshaped hierarchies of development, the actors that are important in the region. Second, also I want to emphasize that we need to contextualize China-Caribbean relations within the region's own developmental history, including recent structural adjustment, liberalization, and debt. And this debt being one of the main factors that have pushed Caribbean governments to make new deals with China. And finally, I like to insist that I think critical Caribbean development thought still offers many answers, and it remains a powerful tool to analyze and theorize the Caribbean's international relations, including those with China. And I'll stop here, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Excellent presentation. I think Laura, who's assisting with this, is trying to see if we can indeed, have here Kai, our discussant. We pin him.
Maybe I'll sit there so that I can see him.
Yeah, that is nice. Hi, Kai.
Hello. Can you hear me?
We do. I don't know if just a little bit. Let me introduce you. You're working in Maastricht University in political economy, in programs on emerging markets. And 2 years ago or so, you were with us with a whole group of students, but today you didn't manage, but fortunately we can have you as the person starting up the discussion. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join you, even though I couldn't join you in person. My apologies. I'm sorry for that. I really would have wanted to be up there, and I hope that I will come soon instead. Since I cannot be there in person, and it might be hard for you to hear me, I will keep this very brief. My thoughts are primarily based on two pieces that I read, rather than the presentation, or at least not strictly based on the presentation. So take that for what it is. Can you hear me?
No.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. So first of all, the pieces that I read, I think they provide an excellent brief description of colonial history, of early globalization, and how the Caribbean nations and their structure in the world provides an example of early globalization. And then also more recent history and how the engagement with China fits into this context. And the papers very clearly describe the continuity of historical structures and how the stronger role of China in the Caribbean countries has not fundamentally changed their economies. I would say as a somewhat critical comment here would be to say that it's not clear to me necessarily why we should expect this engagement to provide a fundamental transformation of their economies, but perhaps other people have different or had different expectations than I did here. In any case, it's very clear that many of the challenges or weaknesses that these economies have, they remain very much the same. And I think that's very well described. And I also really like how these papers, and in particular a book chapter that I read, that I think the presentation is based largely on, I really like how this chapter illustrates the concept of comparative advantage. I'm even thinking of using this in a course on globalization that I teach, and I might extend my course on economics and society in Latin America to include the English-speaking countries that were covered here to incorporate this piece. I like the way that it shows how static comparative advantage can bring benefits in the short run, but lead to challenges in the long run, with countries essentially being stuck in their developmental position, and that is deepened through their engagement with China. So I really like these parts of the papers and the presentation. I have two brief things that I would like to ask for. The first thing that I would like to ask for, as somebody coming out of, let's say, more mainstream economics, I mean, I'm engaging with you all because I'm interested in engaging with people who do not only have a mainstream economics type of background, but still, even so, with my background, I do find the casual use of the neoliberalism concept somewhat careless. And it's not only in this paper, but I do find that it hinders rather than helps engagement, especially if you want to engage with people who are, let's say, slightly outside maybe your own field, or where people use this term in very similar ways. I would like to see more precision and concreteness in the way that the policies and decision processes that you describe are actually described and discussed. And I also would like to see a bit more of grappling with what neoliberalism really means in these countries and in Latin America, or perhaps around the world more generally today, and more of grappling with this in the context of the type of institutions that sometimes, and I think in these papers and in the presentation, are described as the bastions of neoliberalism, the IMF and the World Bank. If you look at the World Bank's website today, at the very least, their descriptions are very different from what they were in the 1990s of what they want to achieve. There's a whole range of documents and presentations and research on the role of transparency, the role of participatory decision-making, etc. And you may or may not believe that this is actually something that is a cornerstone of their thinking nowadays. But at the very least, it's something that is quite frequently discussed and studied and researched in these types of institutions, to the point where some older, let's say, World Bank scholars that are not in the institution, like William Easterly today, think that they've gone too soft and fluffy, in his own words, and want them to return to more of a hardcore focus. So that's one comment that I wanted to make. And the second comment or question that I wanted to ask would be to ask you to try to say more, or this is not necessarily something that you have to do in these papers, which are already written, or this presentation, but in future work, to try to use this to think carefully about what it might take for countries to really benefit from the interactions with China and the deepened engagement of China in their economies. I would like to use this work to better understand who benefits in each country from the deepened interaction with China, and how that depends on the domestic political institutions, the strength of the domestic democracy in the countries that you're focusing on, and the strength of civil society and interest groups, and whether there are things that in principle could be done to improve the outcomes of the engagement with China. And I would be happy to discuss this with you, because I've been involved in work in other countries where you see differences in how much or little different countries benefit from their engagement with China. And it's not constant by any means across countries. And I think we could benefit from using this work to provide a better understanding of what it takes to benefit not only for China, but for the economies that engage with China in both economic and potentially in other ways. So those are my two comments or questions that I would like to ask. And you don't have to answer them now. I'd rather open it up for more discussion, but perhaps we could interact at a later point. I would be very happy to talk to you more at some point in the future. Overall, really very, very interesting and wonderful field work. I really enjoyed reading these papers.
Thanks a lot, Kai. And I do hope, actually, he's still here, right? Yeah. I do hope Ruben wants to react maybe at least to one or two points that you raised, and then we'll continue. Yeah, maybe there so everyone can see you.
Yeah, sure. I actually think I identified three main questions rather than two, but the first one, yeah, fair enough. Why should we expect China to play a transformative role in the Caribbean? For no particular reason, but much of the literature expects that from China. When people study China from an international relations development perspective, they are always focusing on what China is doing that is different, that is transforming the world economy, whether it's providing an alternative to the liberal consensus. And that's a big question in all the scholarship about China's international engagement with the world. So me saying that they don't provide a transformative alternative is speaking to that literature mostly, rather than to the demand that China should be doing so more so than any other country in the world. This relates a little bit with the critique on the casual use of neoliberalism. Yeah, it's, well, first of all, it's, the two papers are about about the region as a whole, so it's very difficult to get into the details of everything that goes on in each of the individual countries. But I can say quickly two things. The way I understand neoliberalism, broadly speaking, is on the one hand as a set of ideas that plays the market and businesses at the center of social development. And this process of deep marketization, which has been occurring since the 80s. It may sound like there is no alternative to many of us nowadays, but there could be different ways of thinking about development that is not so business-centric. And what I try to emphasize here is that business-centric vision is, the World Bank has it, definitely. It's promoting social development through business development in many cases. And China, in a different way, does the same too. It's a very business-centric model of development. I guess I'm also thinking about it from a broad perspective, from a wide spectrum of potential possibilities of what development could mean. And in that sense, I place both China and many Western institutions towards the neoliberal end of the spectrum. Besides that, even though, again, yeah, I guess neoliberalism has been used in many ways, the Caribbean represents mostly the most classical example of neoliberal structural adjustment and how that had a clear impact on debt, on closing down or resizing of social services, deterioration of public healthcare, deterioration of education as a consequence of decreased investment in those sectors to pay back debts through 40 years. And that's, I mean, that's kind of the original definition of the Washington Consensus, liberalization that led to a lost decade of development, just that in the Caribbean it was more than just one decade. I think so that's, I mean, broadly speaking, how I see neoliberalism and how I understand it in that context. And who benefits in each country? Yes, I don't have, I don't say much about that in the paper, in the two papers, but or in the presentation I haven't said much. But I hope to that what comes across is that in maintaining similar structures of development, in maintaining similar social hierarchies, the ones who are benefiting are usually the elites that had been benefiting for the last 40 years or so. So people, kind of this merchant capitalist class that is more focused on trade than production, and some of the traditional elites in the Caribbean. I know this is very broad. We could go into details with each country. But yeah, that's my quick answer to that question. And thanks a lot for the comments. Yeah.
He still sees you. Yeah,
yeah,
you have to look at it.
I look at it. All right.
Thanks. I think we will stop recording. Okay. So